I'm fairly optimistic that the war in Ukraine, which indeed has been going on for almost 8 years now, is not going to motivate new countries to reconsider their past non-proliferation choices and to go about the bomb.
That's the voice of Dr. Alexander Lanoszka, assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and the Balsillie School of International Affairs at the University of Waterloo in Canada. He's one of today's guests on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now here are your co-hosts Tom Collina and Lauren Billet.
Thanks, Angela, and welcome back to Press the Button. So you may have heard my voice a few times before. I'm Lauren Billet, Communications and Marketing Manager at Plowshares, and I will be temporarily joining Tom while we're in this transition period following Michelle's departure. And you'll hear my first interview for the show today. The other two voices you'll be hearing in interviews in the coming weeks will be Alex Hall, Policy Associate, and Angela Kellett, Roger Ale Hell Fellow, both of whom work on the podcast weekly. I am so looking forward to our weekly chats, Tom.
Lauren, me too. Thank you so much for being here. And we will be sure to keep all of you, dear listeners, updated as we go through this transition period. And as always, thank you for your continued support of the podcast.
Yes, thank you. So, Tom, tell us about your weekend.
I had a very nice weekend, Lauren. Thank you. I did something very unusual. I went to a movie. I can't actually remember the last time I went to a movie. So I went to a movie. It was a documentary that was part of the DC Film Festival. I went to downtown DC. It was a big night out. It's very exciting. And we saw a movie called The Janes, which is a documentary about a brave group of women who were in Chicago in the 1960s when abortion was illegal. And they organized a group to provide abortion services to women in the area in the 1960s. So just a fascinating documentary on an incredible slice of history, which unfortunately is becoming much more relevant as that debate is raging again. But in any case, the Janes documentary, if you can catch it, highly recommend it. On the nuclear update front, Russia tested a new long-range ballistic missile last week called the Sarmat. It's a weapon that President Putin said should make the West think twice before taking any actions against Russia. I love this side note. The Pentagon said that Russia had given the United States advance notice about the launch in line with the New START treaty between Washington and Moscow. And I just love the fact that even though, war is raging in Ukraine and Russia is breaking all the rules you can imagine, they're still following the New START treaty by giving the U.S. advance warning about missile tests. So at least some things are still working in the treaty rules-based nuclear sphere. But then Putin hailed the Sarmat launch and said the missile was capable of penetrating any missile defenses. Some media outlets have been saying this is an exaggeration. It's really not, right? I mean, U.S. defenses are sized for a small-scale attack from North Korea, say, not a massive attack from Russia. A Russian nuclear attack, if it was large, whether it be the Sarmat or whatever, would certainly get through. This is not an argument for expanding U.S. defenses, because if we did, well, one, our defenses are unreliable, but if we expanded them, the Russians would expand their offenses, which is the typical offense-defense relationship that we've had with Russia for the last 50 years. And so basically, as long as Russia has nuclear weapons, we will be vulnerable to a Russian nuclear attack, just as Russia is vulnerable to us. That's why it's called mutually assured destruction, MAD. Moving on to Ukraine, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin met with Ukrainian President Zelensky on Sunday in Kyiv. And they told President Zelensky that the United States would be providing more than $300 million in foreign military financing, and that they had approved $165 million in ammunition sales to that country. On Iran, in this case, no news is bad news, and there is no news. Negotiations to revive the 2015 Iran nuclear deal are still stuck. The main point of contention remains the foreign terrorist designation of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. So, of course, if there are any breakthroughs there, we will report them to you here, but so far, none to report. And then finally, a bit of good news, depending on where you are on the political spectrum. Emmanuel Macron won France's presidential election this weekend, beating right-wing candidate Marine Le Pen. He is the first French leader to be reelected in 20 years, which is kind of amazing, taking 58% of the vote. And Lauren, what do you have queued up for us on early warning?
For early warning, I sat down with Lilly Adams, a senior outreach coordinator at the Union of Concerned Scientists Global Security Program. We discussed how RECA, the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, is due to expire in 3 months and how listeners can get involved.
And then I sit down with Dr. Lauren Sukin and Dr. Alexander Lanoszka. We discussed their findings on some fascinating polling they did on how citizens in Poland, Romania, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia view nuclear weapons in the midst of the war in Ukraine. They found some surprising things, so please stay tuned.
And if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback helps us to improve the show. And with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Congress passed the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, also known as RECA, in 1990. It provides one-time compensation for people suffering from illnesses linked to radiation exposure from nuclear testing and uranium mining. Bipartisan legislation was introduced in September of 2021 to strengthen the RECA program and expand its geographic downwinders eligibility. The program is currently limited in its scope compared to the actual number of people impacted by the U.S. nuclear weapons activities and the resources needed. But the clock is running out as RECA will expire in July 2022, only 3 months from now, if Congress does not act. Here to explain the situation, we are joined by Lilly Adams, the Senior Outreach Coordinator with the Union of Concerned Scientists and their Global Security Program. Lilly, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, what should listeners know about RECA?
Right. So as you said, RECA provides that partial restitution to people with radiation-linked cancers. And these are communities and individuals such as people who lived downwind of the Nevada test site, uranium miners and millers. These are often indigenous communities in the southwestern US, and also atomic veterans who were exposed from nuclear tests during their service. So for all of these communities, RECA is a very valuable program for those who are eligible. It's always had really strong bipartisan support, and it's a really important recognition of the harm caused by our government's nuclear activities. And it provides what is often really crucial support to people who are battling these really devastating illnesses and therefore often crippling health expenses. But like you said, it's limited. It's always been a pretty flawed program. It's always excluded some communities that were exposed. So this includes uranium workers after 1971, includes a lot of downwind communities, including those near the first ever nuclear weapons test in New Mexico, the Trinity test, and other highly exposed states, as well as a whole category of veterans who cleaned up nuclear material after tests. So these are a lot of these communities that have never been eligible for RECA benefits. And in addition, the amount of compensation is the same as it was when RECA was enacted 30 years ago, despite inflation and rising healthcare costs. And for most claimants, RECA also doesn't provide medical benefits. So there are a lot of aspects that really need to be improved to meet these communities' needs. And very importantly, as you said, RECA is set to expire in July of this year, and this program must not be allowed to sunset. So the legislation you mentioned that would extend and expand the program is called the RECA Amendments of 2021. So Senators Lujan and Crapo and Representatives Ledger Fernandez and Owens have really been fighting to move this forward. And their bill addresses many of these shortcomings of the existing program. And of course, on the ground, this fight has really been led by the frontline community groups that have experienced this harm firsthand.
This is clearly a very helpful program for a number of people. What are the current obstacles preventing its extension and expansion?
I think that one of the biggest challenges right now that we're facing is just a lack of awareness among elected officials about this issue. In many ways, these communities are the forgotten victims of the Cold War. They sacrificed their health and their lives, sometimes usually unknowingly, in the name of national security. But those sacrifices aren't very well known. So, in the past year, as we've been ramping up our advocacy efforts on this, we often find that when we speak with a congressional office, it's their first time hearing about RECA and this issue. So there's a lot of educational work that we still need to do to make sure that members of Congress understand this issue and why it's so urgent. Also, the groups that have been fighting for this, in some cases, for over a decade, are generally small grassroots groups run by volunteers. They are truly, small but mighty. They do absolutely incredible work, but they don't have interest groups or expensive lobbyists fighting for them, which makes their work really hard and also makes it all the more important that we do what we can to support them.
At the time of this recording, Friday, April 22nd, we're expecting that there will be a vote early next week to extend RECA. Lilly, can you explain why this is important and what we should expect?
Yeah, so we're definitely very excited to hear this news. It's so important because if RECA expires, everyone who's currently eligible but hasn't yet applied will lose that chance. And then these communities will also lose invaluable services like preventative cancer screenings. So, I'm speaking with a woman right now who's applying on behalf of her father-in-law, an atomic veteran, and their family's scrambling to try and put together all the documents and other, forms they need before this deadline. So in addition, all of these communities who are fighting for inclusion in the program will lose the chance to ever get these benefits if Congress doesn't extend RECA. So, as I said, many of these communities have been fighting for over a decade to be recognized, and it would be a huge injustice to all of these communities if RECA expires. So obviously the good news is that because of this vote, we're expecting that RECA will see a short-term extension, and we're expecting that the Senate will pass that. So hopefully by the time this airs, we'll all be celebrating that victory. But this still will need to go through the House and go through the full process, and we're hoping it will move quickly. And extending RECA is a really important first step to ensure the program isn't lost. But what I also really want to emphasize here is that it's really only a first step, and Congress cannot stop there. We still need to keep working to expand the program and improve it, not just extend it. So hopefully once it passes this extension, we still need to fight very hard to ensure that Congress doesn't feel like they are done and have checked this box. All these communities that are currently excluded still urgently need this support. So this is still very much an ongoing fight.
And finally, I'm sure I'm not the only person asking this, but how can listeners get involved?
Right. So the best thing that listeners can do really is to contact their own members of Congress and urge them to support these efforts. Again, not just to extend the program, though we obviously want to see that happen, but to extend and expand RECA. So, we really need to keep building this momentum after hopefully this extension passes. So please, if you're listening, ask your members of Congress to co-sponsor these bills, the RECA amendments of 2021, which is Senate Bill 2798 and House Bill 5338, which again will extend and expand RECA.
Well, unfortunately, Lilly, our time is up, but thank you so much for your important work and for joining us today.
Thanks again for having me.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Shing, the Communications and Marketing Specialist at Plowshares Fund. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has exposed just how close nuclear escalation and nuclear war can be. To meet the urgency of this moment, Plowshares Fund has launched a donation match challenge to make the largest grants possible to those who are working every day to reduce and eliminate nuclear weapons. Right now, all first-time gifts will be matched dollar for dollar, and all new monthly gifts will be matched at their 12-month value. Or increase your giving and the full amount above your last gift will be matched. Go to plowshares.org/donate today. And thanks for listening.
As President Vladimir Putin continues his brutal war in Ukraine, it is not too soon to ask, what are some of the lasting impacts of this crisis that we might see? President Putin invaded Ukraine, a state that gave up the bomb, and has threatened to use nuclear weapons if other nations intervene directly. There's also concern that Putin could use nuclear weapons in Ukraine if he fears he may lose the war. Meanwhile, millions of people have fled Ukraine into neighboring states, resulting in the largest refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. So, in the wake of Russia's invasion, there are legitimate concerns that some states may learn the lesson that they would be better off if they had nuclear weapons. This would be a serious challenge to global efforts to stop the spread of the bomb. So, it would be interesting to know if the war is changing attitudes about nuclear weapons, and if so, how. To help us understand how Russia's nuclear saber-rattling has affected Europe's views on nuclear weapons, we are joined by Dr. Lauren Sukin and Dr. Alexander Lanoszka. Lauren is a MacArthur Nuclear Security Postdoctoral Fellow at Standford University's Center for International Security and Cooperation, and an incoming Assistant Professor of International Relations at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And Alexander is an Assistant Professor in the Department of Political Science and the Balsillie School of International Affairs at the University of Waterloo in Canada. And he is also an Associate Fellow at the London-based Council on Geostrategy. They recently wrote together an article in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists on polling data from citizens in Poland, Romania, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia on their thoughts on nuclear weapons. Thank you both so much for being here. So let's start with your polling data. If you could, give us a sense of how the war in Ukraine is affecting Europeans' perception of nuclear risk.
Thank you so much for having us. We're excited to talk about this work. We were watching the events of the war unfold and thinking, what are states supposed to take away from this? One of the things that we see very clearly is fear about the possibility of Russian nuclear use and distrust of Russia. One piece of evidence for this that we see in the survey is that across those countries you mentioned, between 77 and 93% of those that we polled said that they distrusted Russia's nuclear decision-making. And 9 out of 10 of them have unfavorable views about Russia. So we're seeing in some ways what we would expect in the face of Russian nuclear threats. There's concern about what that means for European security. On the other hand, we're seeing more support for NATO. About 90% of our respondents had pro-NATO views, and 66 to 85% trusted NATO nuclear decision-making in contrast to their attitudes about Russia. So respondents and citizens in Russia's neighbors in these Central and Eastern European countries are seeing a world where nuclear weapons and nuclear threats have a renewed salience. They're concerned about the possibility of nuclear risk, and they're thinking about what the solutions to that might be, and the solutions look like they might involve nuclear weapons, whether that's about their security guarantees or the remote possibility that these states may want to think about proliferation. And we'll maybe talk about that a little bit more, but this was, one of the more surprising things that we found in our work.
Alexander, thoughts to add there?
Well, I would just add about nuclear proliferation itself, that we do uncover variation in attitudes about the desirability of acquiring nuclear weapons. Of course, in some of these countries, the actual physical possibility of developing an independent nuclear weapons arsenal is very limited. We are talking, after all, about the countries of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. But even so, we do observe within those 3 countries interesting variations. So nuclear proliferation looks the least desirable in Lithuania and Latvia. So with respect to Lithuania, about 38% of the population there, of which we have surveyed, is in favor of nuclear proliferation. In contrast, Latvia is 40% in favor of nuclear proliferation. We see the Romanians and the Estonians much more split on this issue. Of course, Romania is interesting because over the course of the latter half of the Cold War, it did have a nuclear program. But perhaps what is more interesting is what we find in Poland, whereby we do observe about 2/3 of the public, at least those that we have surveyed, declare openly their support for having a national nuclear weapons program. Of course, Poland is in a better position, so to speak, in acquiring these sorts of capabilities by dint of its size. It has the largest military economy of the surveyed states. I would still say, though, that the prospects of Poland acquiring nuclear weapons is limited because of the technical as well as international legal challenges involved. I would also add that citizens' expectations about the costs of proliferation are almost certainly misinformed. We see 2/3 across our surveyed countries believe that acquiring nuclear weapons would not prompt the United States to change its assistance to that country. And I think the historical record suggests that view is completely false, that we do observe the United States change aspects of its security relationship when they do observe its allies undertake a nuclear weapons acquisition in some form or another. What is also fascinating is that many who are in favor of acquiring nuclear weapons might still actually oppose nuclear weapons use for ethical reasons. Across our survey, about 85% of respondents report that there are no situations in which using nuclear weapons would be morally justified. So that seems to us that they don't necessarily want to have access to nuclear weapons because they want to use them, or they might believe in particular theories of warfighting or deterrence. I think what it suggests is that they might want more of a presence in nuclear decision making than what their countries already have. They might feel that by having their hand on the nuclear trigger, so to speak, they're going to avail themselves of greater decision-making authority. They don't simply trust other countries to make these sorts of decisions on their own behalf.
Interesting. And you covered a lot of ground there. So let me try to unpack that a little bit and break it up. So the first is this interesting distinction between countries seem to want their own nuclear weapons rather than just being part of the NATO nuclear umbrella. So help us understand that. Why do you think there's this, and you just mentioned part of it, maybe it's this desire to have more control over it. But give us a sense of why you think the people you polled would rather have their own national program than be part of the NATO umbrella.
So I would just start by clarifying it's not that they don't want to be part of the NATO nuclear umbrella. We're seeing really high levels of support for NATO, but we're not seeing as robust support for stationing tactical nuclear weapons in these countries. About only 1/3 of the respondents that we polled said they would want NATO tactical nuclear weapons on their soil. Now, that looks a little bit different than these high levels of support that we're getting for national proliferation programs. So what's that about? What does that mean? Well, there are a couple different ways to think about this. One is to say people understand nuclear weapons as a source of deterrence. It's a way to stop a nuclear fight from happening, not a warfighting tool that they expect to or even want to use in the midst of a conflict. So having their own nuclear weapons program might provide them with that reliable sense of security. We also get the sense that there are concerns about who makes that decision about when and why you might use nuclear weapons. Now, my own research is really focused on this question. My work thinks about nuclear security guarantees, and I've argued that countries who are under the nuclear security umbrella, who have promises of nuclear protection, might worry that the states offering them that protection can sometimes be too aggressive. So if we think about South Korea, where a lot of my work has been, when Trump in 2017 starts talking about fire and fury, maybe that looks like, yes, the United States is going to come to South Korea's aid, but also maybe it looks like the United States, which has offered you this promise of protection, could escalate, it could use nuclear weapons, it could drag you into this huge, horrible fight that's going to have these direct consequences on you and the territory of these countries. So our bigger project is going to explore this dimension a little bit more, thinking about those dynamics in Eastern Europe. But one possibility for why we're seeing support for proliferation is this attitude of these countries need to be able to say when and why nuclear weapons should be used. Now, that's not to say that proliferation is necessarily the best option for that. I think what that tells us is crisis consultation, is things like careful nuclear planning, communication within NATO, within these alliances, can help these states understand that they do have leverage within the security architecture and help figure out some of these gaps in communication about the possibility of nuclear use and nuclear escalation. So we see this support for proliferation as evidence of these types of worries and concerns but not necessarily an indication that, Estonia is going to go out and build nuclear weapons. Like Alexander said, that's a really remote possibility. But, it does tell us that these things might be part of the conversation, that if a Polish leader really wanted to push a nuclear program, public opinion is probably not the stopgap.
Now, you also mentioned that the people that you survey may not be completely informed about the trade-offs, right? That if they were to develop indigenous nuclear programs, it's not clear that they understand what the implication might be for US or NATO assistance. Is that right?
I think that's right. I think if we look at the historical record, especially from the Cold War, we find that the United States resorts to all sorts of different tools in order to compel their allies not to seek nuclear weapons, however far they go down that particular path. With respect to South Korea in the 1970s, the United States threw everything at the problem. It very subtly intimated that it would pull out its nuclear forces from the peninsula. It had also undertaken various economic sanctions targeting South Korean financing of some key industries that were being lifted off the ground, so to speak. At that time, we see private assurances to the effect that the United States would indeed defend the South from the North, should that be necessary. We are, in other words, seeing the United States employ both carrots and sticks to rein in those programs. And I believe that what we see in the data that we had accumulated from our survey and survey experiments this past month more or less speaks to this particular issue, that individual citizens do not quite understand that the United States has a record of counterproliferation and non-proliferation, that it is fairly credible in going about those particular interests, however unevenly that might be. Of course, there are some instances where the United States might have turned a blind eye or might have been a little more relaxed in its approach with respect to counterproliferation, but be that as it may, the United States does tend to put pressure on key allies, especially because it might fear that it loses escalation control or simply wishes to prevent a particular state from undertaking aggressive foreign policies that might, in fact, be emboldened to pursue should it acquire those nuclear weapons capabilities.
And now, how do you balance all that against another finding that you mentioned before, that a majority of the folks that you spoke to have relatively negative views about nuclear weapons and no desire to use them? How does that all make sense?
We find that there's some negative attitudes about nuclear weapons. In particular, we find that 85% of those who took our survey said there were no situations in which the use of nuclear weapons would be morally justified. Now, there are a couple caveats to that. There's good research and political science that has shown that people might espouse those views and then not actually follow through on them when you ask them about their specific preferences for nuclear use. For example, Ben Valentino and Scott Sagan's work on this question gives us some good insight into some of the limitations of those normative opposition findings that we had in this survey. That being said, though, it does show an interesting dichotomy. Part of the reason why I said earlier that we don't necessarily think people are thinking about proliferation as a way of obtaining a usable warfighting tool is that we do see this opposition. And I think this number, this 85% sort of moral aversion to nuclear weapons, is maybe telling us that nuclear weapons are thought of as more defensive, that the goal is to not just have the tools to deter, but to also be able to say, hey, this is a situation where we don't want to use nuclear weapons, and we trust our own government to make that decision. That's going to look different in different places and in different contexts, but it shows us that it's not just about hawkishness. It's not that we're seeing some type of aggression or political ideology that's telling people that they need to build up their militaries. There's also an element of caution and of not wanting to make the situation worse, not wanting to be involved in a nuclear war that is still influencing people's views.
I would also add that I think it speaks to some of the uncertainty that we have about nuclear deterrence in general. I tend to be very much in favor of nuclear deterrence, but I'm the first to admit that there's not really much evidence to really support any one particular position either way, because we don't really have cases where we can leverage important variation. Nuclear weapons have only been used twice, and that was in 1945. And we don't really consider those bombings to constitute a nuclear war, failure of nuclear deterrence. And so I think there's this loose understanding that nuclear weapons are good for deterrence in the manner as what Lauren had said, but it's actually fairly unclear how the causal mechanism works. It seems that with respect to what we're finding in the data, as well as elsewhere, there's this understanding that if you get nuclear weapons, that in its own right gets you nuclear deterrence. But of course, there are many things that have to happen between those two steps. It's not entirely clear how nuclear deterrence simply results from the acquisition of one bomb or just having an indigenous nuclear weapons program. And so I think what we're seeing is a little bit of that uncertainty and some of that, I don't want to say wishful thinking, I would say perhaps poorly thought out causal mechanisms. But nevertheless, I would not want to just say that this is just the function of how these survey respondents consider these issues. I think actually the problem is perhaps even more widespread. But I think it indeed speaks to some of the looseness in our thinking about nuclear proliferation and nuclear deterrence. And I think some of the tensions that we're seeing in the data speak to these particular issues.
Let me ask you a different question to your data. What in your data surprised you the most?
I think we were most surprised about the high levels of support for proliferation. 2/3 of the public in Poland supporting nuclear proliferation is a really high number. In South Korea, again, we've been talking about this a lot, but in some ways it's the right comparison because public support for proliferation in South Korea has been high for many years, and it hovers around that 2/3 number. That's been true over time across multiple different survey firms and different organizations that have looked into this question. And that's considered, a really severe or really significant public attitude. It's shaped political conversations. Proliferation was an issue in the recent South Korean presidential election. There's a lot of work that's being done on this question and a lot of thinking about what the alternatives might be. Should they be investing in conventional counterforce capabilities? Do we need nuclear planning in East Asia? And that conversation isn't really happening in the same way when we're thinking about Poland, right? There isn't as much of this conversation around the public wants this nuclear program. What does that mean? And so to have that high number, I think, tells us just how severe some of these nuclear fears are. That doesn't mean that this is something that will stay, right? We're looking at one moment in time in the middle of a crisis. But I think that number surprised us because it is so high. And we would love to be able to ask these questions as the war goes on and see how it evolves. Maybe we just sort of captured the shock, in sort of the midst of the invasion. But it does, I think, tell me that this is something that we need to study and we need to think about seriously and figure out sort of what the implications are and what are the limitations, of what we really know about public attitudes towards nuclear weapons in Central and Eastern Europe.
I would add that what I think is also fairly puzzling is that not only do we see fairly high levels of support for nuclear proliferation, especially in the Polish context, but also that we're having this finding precisely when we also see that Central and Eastern Europeans nevertheless still have a high level of confidence in NATO, that about 2/3 to maybe even 85% of survey respondents, depending on the country, of course, do say that they trust nuclear decision-making within NATO, and that they also, for that matter, trust or provide support for unilateral US nuclear decision-making at about similar ranges. So I think that's very puzzling because I literally wrote a book a few years ago to the effect of how countries or country leaders rather want to seek nuclear weapons or more likely to seek nuclear weapons if they have their confidence in the received security guarantees badly shaken, especially if they observe, for instance, unilateral troop withdrawals from their own territory or other changes in force posture when they're facing an acute existential threat. Here, we're observing a situation where these countries are facing an acute existential threat, and yet they still exhibit high levels of support for NATO, for the United States, and more to the point, for American nuclear decision-making, that they nevertheless want to have greater access to nuclear decision making themselves, especially perhaps in the case of Poland with respect to independent nuclear weapons capabilities.
And now, after studying the data from these 5 states, would you, and again, I know this is not complete information, would you expect any of them to actually change their policies going forward as a result of the war in Ukraine?
I think the 3 Baltic countries have been very insistent that they're good citizens of the international community and that they'll abide by the nuclear proliferation treaty. I think Poland and Romania are much the same way. However, I think in Poland, there's perhaps a greater appetite, especially among members of the political class, to host tactical nuclear weapons. And indeed, the chairperson of the ruling political party, Jarosław Kaczynski, did suggest that if the United States were to want to place tactical nuclear weapons on Polish territory, he would not be opposed. And indeed, there's been similar language from other Polish leaders from the last 5 years. That being said, notwithstanding what we find in the survey experiment that we ran last month, Poles typically have been a little more reluctant to host, let's say, theater range missiles, even of a conventional variety, on their territory. There, of course, may be a greater appetite to host such platforms as opposed to other European countries, most notably those in Western Europe. But I do think that there is still some resistance. It's not clear, however, whether that resistance has dissipated in light of what we've been seeing from Russia since February.
Lauren, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think it's important to highlight, as we have, the support for NATO that we've seen increase in light of these current events. And that's not a phenomenon that's just limited to Central and Eastern Europe, even though that's been our focus here. I think there will be real implications for NATO going forward. In many ways, these events were a test of NATO cohesion, and NATO has come out showing that it can sort of muster support and can coordinate, and that's an important implication of what's been happening.
I would also add that decisions to acquire nuclear weapons are typically very complex. I think there's this mistake in the academic literature to presume that one factor and one factor only can truly explain all elements of the nuclear decision-making cycle, pun intended. What really is the case is that a number of factors do go into these sorts of considerations, and these factors can include the positioning a country might have in the global economy, the sorts of beliefs that leaders have about the efficacy of military power or nuclear weapons, their relationship with the United States, their relationship with their own adversaries, state-society relations, beliefs within society about the efficacy of these tools or potential tools, as well as international norms and legal structures. In other words, there's just a whole lot of things that have to go on for any particular country to decide to embark on these sorts of decisions. And as such, I'm fairly optimistic that the war in Ukraine, which indeed has been going on for almost 8 years now, is not going to motivate new countries to reconsider their past non-proliferation choices and to go about the bomb. I think that position is overstated. I don't think you need to look at the Ukrainian example to say that a particular nuclear decision is right or wrong. I think so many factors go into these sorts of things that it's not entirely clear to me as to how any particular data point we can gather here would be truly decisive for turning a country that to date has abided by its non-proliferation commitments to, in fact, go about seeking the bomb.
Right. And I think we should also say, this is a limitation of having studied public opinion here, right? We're not saying that this is the official position of the states or the attitudes of leaders. We're saying this concern is evident among citizens in these states, and that's something political leadership has to reconcile with. But at the same time, it doesn't necessarily mean that it really changes those strategic incentives for whether or not proliferation is a good option. It might remove one barrier, but that's only one part of a much more complicated equation.
I would also argue that if there is a valid concern for any one of those countries to acquire nuclear weapons, other actors will use their own agency and respond accordingly. If there is a genuine concern that, say, Romania were to acquire nuclear weapons, countries are not going to stand idly by while that happens. we're going to do things as members of the international community to ensure that won't happen or to raise the cost for that to happen. The United States, again, has agency here, no doubt about it. It has used that agency to clamp down on potential proliferators. And precisely because the United States has expanded its ties with countries like Poland and Romania, especially in the last decade, then I would suspect that the United States would leverage those ties in order to assure a particular non-proliferation outcome. After all, we forgot to mention that only a quarter of respondents anticipate economic sanctions in the event of a proliferation program. That, I think, is, again, a false belief. It does not align with the historical record. And so I think if respondents have a clear idea of the cost, they might not be as supportive. So I believe that these beliefs are very much contingent, and I would not read too much into them. But they're still, of course, very interesting because they do represent a particular moment in time as we observe the largest ground war taking place in Europe since the Second World War.
And that conversation about sanctions is also going to look different across different relationships. We found in this survey that only a quarter of individuals thought that the US would impose sanctions if they sought nuclear weapons programs. Those numbers look much higher in the survey work that I've done elsewhere in South Korea and Japan, for example. So there may be some cases where it's already understood that sanctions would be the consequence of proliferation, where additional threats of sanctions may have less effect. But in countries that haven't really considered nuclear programs or haven't done that publicly, where there isn't really an understanding of the costs and consequences of that decision making, if there were really a threat that any of these countries would seek nuclear weapons, there are lots of steps that the international community should and probably would take, including sanctions, to try to help reverse those considerations or find alternate solutions. I think what our results tell us is that those need to take into account this desire for these countries to have agency in their nuclear futures and to have influence in conversations about nuclear planning and about the possible escalation of conflicts in their region.
What do you think are some other lessons about nuclear policy that nations might take away from this war, either good or bad? Things that war in Ukraine might have changed on nuclear policy going forward?
So I'll just start with one simple implication, which is this is a conflict where we've seen threats to nuclear power plants in a way that hasn't been salient in international conversations before. I think it raises the need for more conversation and perhaps international agreement on what types of nuclear targets are acceptable or not acceptable in warfare, of having protections around civilian nuclear infrastructure. So there are conversations even beyond the issues of proliferation and security that we've been talking about today, where there is a lot more thinking that needs to be done. And the war has highlighted for us some of those concerns and considerations.
I do believe that NATO will still stand very strong, that attitudes towards it will be very stable in this particular region. However, I also do think that as Russia's conventional military power suffers more and more attrition, we are going to see the Russian leadership, especially of this variety, lean more and more on nuclear weapons for trying to ascertain some sort of coercive value at the expense of its neighbors. And so as much as the alliance is standing fairly strong today, I think that it is in for some challenges in the future. I think we're going to observe a little more nuclear brinkmanship. And that nuclear brinkmanship could take the form of specific efforts to try to decouple some members of NATO from the rest of the alliance. I have in mind, of course, those that fall within Russia's Western European neighborhood. So, of course, the Baltics and Poland. They might range particular weapons to decouple them from the United States or even from Western European allies like France and Germany. And precisely because we don't really know as much as we like to think we know with respect to nuclear brinkmanship, there's going to be a lot of learning involved. And I think people are going to have a lot of debates as to what is the best response. I might very well lean into the camp that a strong response might be in fact necessary just to quote unquote restore deterrence. But nevertheless, I understand that there are other views here that are valid and that not necessarily be the best response in some instances. But I think this is going to be a very active space in terms of how we think about nuclear deterrence. And quite frankly, we're just going to get more data. And those data are going to be useful for trying to adjudicate some of the arguments that we've had since the Cold War. And I think we're going to be learning a lot more, perhaps more than we want to, but I think that's what's going to happen in the years, if not decade to come.
Alexander and I might disagree on some of those debates. It's not necessarily clear, right, as Alexander said, that the escalate to de-escalate logic works, and maybe it does and maybe it doesn't. But I think that we'll learn from this experience and can learn from other states that are living on the nuclear brink. We can think about the types of political behavior that we see in India and Pakistan as, they live with nuclear threats and navigate those situations as well. So I think the emphasis is really to say, this is the threat of nuclear war is maybe not something that has been as relevant or as important in people's minds, maybe in Europe and the United States, as it is now, but there are lots of lessons to be learned here and conversations to have lots of other places around the world where these nuclear threats are constant. And it's important for us to try to navigate that and figure out what we can do to address them and prevent any use of nuclear weapons from happening to the best of our ability.
Lauren, Alexander, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for being here. And this topic will stay with us for better or worse for a while, but just really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billet and Angela Keller, and in San Francisco by Jacqueline Shing and Delphine Richard, with research and assistance from Alex Hall, Harry Tarpey, and Desiree Cepedis. Audio engineering and sound design by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.